Hello, welcome to English Country Life and welcome to the garden on a glorious day. We're outdoors, so please forgive birdsong, tractors, the engines of Spitfires as they go overhead, and that particular noisy chicken, which is Annie. This video is part of the series that we're doing on the restoration of vintage axes, and we're using this axe to illustrate the process. This is an old Kent pattern axe head. We're at the stage of the restoration where I need to sort out the profile, the shape of the cutting edge, and sharpen the axe. Now, axes can be asked to perform several tasks, and for each task there's a better shape for the axe head to be. So the purpose of today's video is to look at what might we want to do with an axe, and what shape of axe head best performs those particular tasks. In order to understand the correct shape for an axe head for a particular task, we need to understand to some extent the anatomy of a tree and the construction of wood. So to that end, here's a log. And what I want you to imagine is that that log consists of a bundle of wood fibres, and they go along the length of the log. So they look almost like this bundle of pencils. And those fibres perform both the structure of the tree and almost the circulatory system, but that almost doesn't matter. What matters is it's a bunch of fibres that run vertically, in this case, along the length of the tree. What that then means, when you take an axe, is that there are basically three types of cut. We can cut along the length, means we are cutting between the fibres. We can cut across the log, which means we are not dividing the fibres, we're cutting across the fibres along their length. And we can also shape the log. This is known as hewing. Those are the three cuts. Now, hewing is quite specialised. It's done rarely these days. Shaping a log with an axe or an adze was done far more before enormous powered sawmills were widely available. Still done. You can still get the tools, and we can look at it in another video, but for the purposes of today, that's a very specialised application that requires a very specialised geometry of tool to perform, and that's not the function of today. We're looking at general purpose axes today. So what we're most going to concern ourselves about is our axe for splitting, is it for cross-cutting, or is it for a bit of both? So we have two activities to cover. We have to cover splitting and cross-cutting. And in order to consider those well, we need to think about three attributes of the axe head: the shape of the cutting edge, the thickness of the head, and the shape of the cheek, the flat surface at the side of the axe head. And different shapes of each of those things will lend themselves either more to cross-cutting or more to splitting, or to some extent more to hewing. So we'll look at splitting first, and we'll use my handy dandy wood fibre tool to illustrate it. I'll bring you in close, and then we'll examine what attributes make a good splitting axe. Let's consider this our virtual log then, bundled wood fibres. In order to split it, we need to bring our axe in from the top, and we need to divide those wood fibres. They need to come apart. And actually what the axe head is doing isn't cutting through wood fibres, it's sliding between them and forcing them apart in a wedge-like motion. In fact, a lot of the wood I split with wedges and not with axes. What becomes clear very quickly when you do that is that an axe with a wide angle only has to penetrate a short way to force the fibres a long way apart, and then the log just pops. You don't have to drive the axe in very far. If you have an axe with a very thin angle, going in the same distance, it only makes a tiny little split, and that probably won't run the length of the log. So you have to drive the head in considerably further to get the log to split. What I'm going to do in a second is show you two different types of axe head and their geometries, and it will become very clear which is the more effective splitter. So here we are looking down on top of two different axe heads. This one is called a maul, and this is one that I use for splitting apart the sections of large tree trunks. This one is a limbing axe, and I use that for striking off the branches at the side of a tree after it's been felled. I think the difference in geometry is obvious. This pops those wood fibres apart really easily, whereas this will tend to bury itself if I drive it into a tree trunk, but without pushing the fibres apart enough that the split runs to the bottom, so the axe will stick. Here we are again looking down on the top of one of my axes, and the next thing I want to consider is the shape in this plane that an axe needs to be. It's very hard to show you on my axes, partly because they're razor sharp, partly because I need to exaggerate the effect in order to demonstrate it clearly. So I'm going to bring in some shaped pieces of wood to show the shape that we need along here, along the cheek of the axe. Here we are then, looking down in the centre, a real axe, and we're looking down onto the cross section of the axe head. Each of the wooden models is intended to illustrate a different form of potential axe head. This one, completely flat ground, just a classic wedge. This one, more of a curve, a Gothic arch if you like, a convex curve on the outside, and we call that a convex grind. And what I want to look at now is, how do those grinds affect the ability to split? What we can see here is our flat ground axe penetrating the wood fibres. And as you can see, as it slides in, this bit, the cutting edge, is pretty much in tight contact all the way down as it drives those fibres apart. Let's contrast that with a convex grind. Now let's do that again with our convex ground axe. And I'm going to pick that up just a bit so that you can see it better. Because this axe is convex ground, the cheeks of this grind are forcing the fibres apart, and the cutting edge is actually drifting through an air gap. So what's doing the work are these cheeks here acting as a wedge. It's not the cutting edge is severing fibre, all we're doing is pushing them apart. Now what that means is your sharpened edge here is not getting much abuse. And if down here you've got a knot in the wood, that cutting edge will probably never even touch it. It won't get dinked by hitting a knot because the wood fibres are being forced apart by these cheeks. Let me show you a different thought. If I want to hew, and I know we're not really looking at that, but if I want to scrape off some of the wood at the side to flatten it into a beam, I think it's easy for you to see here that a much flatter grind lends itself to that, because if I try and do that with a convex grind, I almost have to dig it in and it rolls out from the hewing cut, because I'm bringing my axe in like this, trying to, and what it's going to do is roll it off the cutting edge. So I would have a much flatter grind for hewing, because in effect what you're doing here is planing down the wood, and you want an edge geometry that lends itself to that activity. So if we do come back and talk about hewing at some point in the future, you can see how this different type of geometry lends itself much more to the hewing cut than it does to the splitting cut. What I'd like to do next is look at the different geometries of the cutting edge of the bit. This wooden model has a curved cutting edge, this a straight one. You'll often see axes with a straight edge referred to as Carpenter's axes. In order to show you the effect that those different edge geometries have on cuts, we'll bring the camera in lower and we'll take a good look. So let's examine the two edge geometries and understand the type of cut they lend themselves to. First, a splitting type impact cut. We bring in our rounded cutting edge and a tiny amount of it makes initial contact. So all the force that's put into that axe swing makes contact in a tiny area. So force per unit area extremely high, and it starts the split, starts the cut very easily. If we look at a flat edge geometry, it all comes in spread out over a wide area. All the cutting edge makes contact at the same time. That dispels the force over a much wider area. But let's look at a planing or hewing or shaping type cut. In comes our curved bit, and what you can see, only a small amount again is actually making contact. So if you're shaving off wood by shaping in this way, you're shaving off small pieces. When you bring in your flat bit, which has the same edge geometry as a plane iron, you can hew off much wider pieces of wood. So that was understanding a bit about form and function. What shapes of axe can impact what abilities? Now let's recap. This is a limbing axe. It has an incredible thin blade, very acute angle on the blade, and that's because it is designed to penetrate across the fibres. It has to cut through the fibres. It's not trying to force them apart. So it needs to be very thin in order to do that. It also needs minimal convexing in order to do that, because the convexing of the head on a splitting axe is designed to pop the fibres apart, but we're not popping them apart with a limbing axe, we're severing them. And again, we need a slight curve to the cutting edge in order that it penetrates well. Compare and contrast to the 8-pound maul. Very wide angle of blade, quite pronounced convexing to the edge, and a fair bit of a curve on the cutting edge. It's basically a big spiky sledgehammer that's going to pop those fibres apart, not chop through them. What does that teach us then about our vintage project axe? Well, it's thin. It's only 1.25 pounds in weight. It's never going to be a splitter of great logs. It doesn't lend itself to that task, and if that's what you want, you've got the wrong tool here. And one of the reasons this pole was mushroomed is someone's tried to use this to split a great big log and pounded on it with a hammer. If you want to split big logs, we can talk about the right way of doing it with other tools. This is not the tool for the job. Great for chopping sticks and kindling, great for a bit of shaping, general garden duties. So we will sharpen it with a gentle convex on the cutting edge and a gentle curve to the bit. That will maximise its ability to penetrate and avoid any tendency to stick. That's the sharpening geometry that we're going to use. And in the next video, we'll look at how to make that hair-poppingly sharp and properly profiled to make the best of a little light axe head like that. Well done for making it to the end of axe geometry. But it's important. There's no point in looking at how do we remove metal from an axe to make it sharp if we're not absolutely clear on what shape we're trying to end up with when we do that. It also informs our decision of what axe to use, what axe to purchase. So understanding a little bit of the basics of axe geometry really is a very important thing if we're going to get into sharpening and maintaining them. That was this episode. Next episode is the actual sharpening technique, now that we know what we want to end up with. If this kind of content is useful to you, please take just a moment right now, click the thumbs up icon down below and leave us a comment. That really helps when people talk to us, explain what they like to see on the channel. It makes our life so much easier. We've enjoyed hanging out with you. Please come back and see us again soon. Take care.